Do audiobooks count as reading? Anti-intellectualism, and are books political? You may be thinking, what do these have to do with each other, or one of these is not like the others? I thought the same thing. Initially, when I sat down to make this video, I wanted to talk about just a few different community topics that have been coming up in the book community recently. But as I was writing this video, I started noticing how these ideas are kind of connected, the kind of reciprocal and even cyclical nature of how they are connected, and may also explain why these discourses keep coming up repeatedly throughout the years. So this video is meant to be a discussion. I'm mainly using my own anecdotal experiences and just what I've noticed in the book community, but I've also linked some research whenever it's relevant to give some objective backing to some of the things that I say. So first we have to address the age-old question of, do audiobooks count as reading? And also, where does this question even stem from? Why does it keep coming back every year? To be frank, it's a discussion that I'm kind of tired of having, but it comes up every year nonetheless. Especially at the end of the year when people post their end of year book wrap-ups. If someone has read a lot of books, like over 100, someone in the comments is bound to basically say, well, those were audiobooks, so it doesn't count. And there are different sides to this audiobooks don't count as reading debate. One is from an attitude of elitism. It seems like some people want to preserve the sanctity of the act of reading, or it's posing as some sort of defense against anti-intellectualism. Some claim that you cannot possibly understand or appreciate the full nuance of a text by listening to it, or you're not getting the full benefits of reading in general by listening. One idea that I see a lot related to this is the idea that listening to an audiobook makes reading passive, which is an idea I'm going to come back to later because I very much disagree with that. And another side of this argument is probably one that is the more common opinion probably, and it's just people being pedantic about the definition of reading, is people are usually fine with audiobooks and fine that people read audiobooks, but they just want to make clear that definitionally, it is not reading. What's crazy is that I see this argument from people who aren't even readers as well. Like, I will tell someone who isn't a reader that I read a book via audiobook, and they'll be like, well, you didn't read it, you listened to it. Obviously, some people regarding the argument of audiobooks not counting as reading are just being confrontational or rage baity, but I do think that both perspectives, whether they are vehemently anti-audiobook or just pedantic about it, both are kind of underlied by this viewpoint of not wanting to adapt the definition of reading into something new. So I want to start with where I disagree with these viewpoints, but I do want to clarify that whenever I am comparing the benefits or the process of audiobooks versus physical books, I am talking about it in the sense of leisure and pleasure reading, not in an academic context. A lot of the research that has been done regarding the differences between audiobooks and physical books has been done within an academic context, looking at people reading nonfiction and seeing how well they're able to comprehend or recall the information later. And a lot of those studies did show that a lot of the students were able to learn better by reading a physical text visually. And so I'm not here to say that there are not certain situations where one may be better than the other. However, a lot of these studies do make the caveat that when it comes to narrative stories or reading for pleasure, that a lot of these differences are not significant. And so that's kind of the reference point that I'm going with for this video. So I mentioned that a lot of the resistance that comes with counting audiobooks as reading comes from this idea of not wanting to change the definition of reading or adapt it to a modern age. And so I kind of wanted to talk about what we mean when we ask the question to someone, have you read this book? Like, what information are you attempting to gather? You are asking them if they have consumed the story, if they are able to talk about the story. You are not asking them what mode they received the information from. The vast majority of people who do count audiobooks as reading are not under the impression that reading physically and listening to an audiobook are the exact same process. It's rather we are saying that they functionally are, that they lead to the same place where we are able to discuss the text in its entirety. And to back this up even more, there was a study in 2019 that showed that there was no significant difference in the processing of semantic information, regardless of the sensory modality in which the person consumed it, whether that was auditory or visual. In other words, whether someone listened to the story or read the story visually, they had similar patterns of activation in the brain. So all that to say that we understand that the information of a text is encoded differently depending if you listen to it or read it physically, but eventually they get to the same comprehension centers of the brain. You are activating the same processes of thought and higher level thinking. And I also do acknowledge that there are nuances to each and more information that is provided from each. For instance, in physical books, there is more visual spatial cues about where something is situated in the text, and in audiobooks, you have more tonal cues and more information about the flow of a text. And so I think as a society, we should just be able to acknowledge that words change in different contexts and acknowledge that read, in this sense, when talking about audiobooks, is talking about consuming a text that was originally written. Another angle about audiobooks that gets brought up is the idea that audiobooks take away some of the benefits of reading that come with reading physically. And again, I just want to emphasize that a lot of these so-called benefits still apply whether you are reading physically or audiobooks. Broadening your vocabulary, developing empathy, broadening your perspectives, all come from the content and processing of the story, not how you read it. Stress relief and relaxation, even strengthening creativity. A lot of people say that they can't visualize books the same way that they do when they are reading physically, like they can't form that movie in their head. That just might be different people's experiences. I can't speak to that, but I know for myself, it is the same exact experience that goes on in my head. And when I recall a book and what happened in the book, the same image appears in my head, whether it was physical or audiobook. There are also some benefits to audiobooks that it has over reading physically, like the idea of accessibility. Reading a physical book is something that you have to be doing like by itself. You can't be doing anything else. Whereas audiobooks, I can listen to while I'm doing something else that doesn't require the full attention of my brain. When I'm doing chores, when I'm having a long drive or commute, things in my brain is kind of on autopilot and I have space for something more. And that is a game changer for a lot of people, including myself, because instead of having to deliberately carve out time to read every day, you can fit reading into your already existing schedule. There is something to be said about the fact that we constantly have to carve things into our already existing schedule and that we don't have the flexibility to just have more free time, but that's a discussion about capitalism and our society for another day. The fact of the matter is that I wouldn't be able to read as much without audiobooks, and so any potential positive that reading physically has over audiobooks is kind of negated by the fact that I just wouldn't be able to read physically given my current schedule. And that's not even mentioning the accessibility factor that audiobooks give to people who are blind, who have ADHD and have focus issues, or who have migraines and don't like that eye strain for so long. And also being more accessible is important for honing more literacy in this country on a societal level. I think when we talk about literacy, I think we are mostly referring to the concept of being able to physically read and write, being able to look at these symbols and create words and understand them. However, this is to my understanding, so correct me if I'm wrong, the problem of literacy in the United States is not necessarily that people can't read or write at all, but it is more of that higher level literacy that is lacking, being able to understand and utilize language at a deeper, more complex level. And I mentioned that audiobooks have more tonal cues, which is very important when it comes to fluency and actually understanding words in their context. It's kind of like when you're learning a foreign language and they say that the best way to do that is through immersion in a native country. It's similar to that with English. If you are reading something that is challenging for you, it is extremely helpful to listen to someone read it with the flow and the tone that it needs. That you can also then apply back to when you're reading physically because you're developing more of that fluency. So anyway, this video is not supposed to be about this advertisement for audiobooks and why I think they're good and beneficial and should count as reading. And I also want to emphasize that I'm not against reading physically at all. Like I said, I think there's a synergistic benefit to both. I just want to go back to that main question I have about whether audiobooks count as reading and why we keep having this discussion given all those reasons and defenses I mentioned. And one of the reasons, I think, is because as a society, we've kind of propped reading up as this sort of intellectual activity. Being someone who reads can be seen as a proxy for intelligence, for someone having a lot of free time and time that they can just devote to leisurely activities, or even a proxy for self-discipline, for being able to sit down and finish an entire book that requires focus. So we've kind of ascribed this moralistic value to reading. And so if you do something that makes that process more accessible, perhaps even a little easier, like audiobooks, Some people might think that you didn't work hard enough to achieve that moral value. It may be seen as kind of like cheating the system, of getting the reputation of being a reader without doing the work for it. Again, this is just my interpretation, so feel free to disagree, but that's kind of the vibe that I get. So speaking of work, I want to go back to this idea of listening being seen as a passive activity, whereas reading a physical book is more of an active activity. That idea is really boggling to me, not gonna lie. But I understand where people are coming from in the sense that a book cannot be read unless someone reads it, unless you sit down there and read it. Whereas an audiobook can play, and it's not necessarily guaranteed that the person will be listening. But to that I say, have you never heard of skimming a text? A lot of times people who are reading physically are also not fully paying attention, not fully absorbing what they are reading. There are times where I have gone through multiple pages where I'm like, I have no idea what just happened. I have no idea what's going on, both in physical books and audiobooks, and I have to just go back in either situation. Also, listening is not a passive activity. I don't know where people are getting this idea. Ask anyone with ADHD, any student for that matter. Listening can be exhausting, it can be tiring because you have to absorb so much information and think a lot. My point that I really want to emphasize is that neither reading physically or audiobooks are inherently active or passive. You can be passive in anything that you do. It is not the modality that changes that. Specifically when it comes to the idea of comprehending and absorbing what a text is saying. To that note, neither medium is inherently more intellectual or another. It is what you bring to the table, your thoughts, your analyses, your interpretations, that makes something an intellectual activity or not. Alrighty, so it is actually a different day. I kept the same outfit for continuity, but we're just gonna ignore that and move on. So now that I've rattled off about audiobooks, where does anti-intellectualism play into this? So I mentioned how there is a cohort of people who are very adamantly against audiobooks counting as reading because of this supposed defense against anti-intellectualism, or at least a preservation of the intellectualization of reading. And that can make sense if you truly believe that audiobooks are passive and that you're not getting anything from them as much as you would with a physical book. But that perspective is very much adhering to a sort of more traditional, borderline elitist perspective on reading. And so when you have that point of view kind of attacking people, other people are going to get defensive. They're going to respond in a way that rejects those presumptions. And a common way that this comes up is people saying that reading is supposed to be pleasurable at the end of the day. It is something you do in your free time, so why do you care how I read? You'll hear things like let people enjoy things, let people do what they want if it's not hurting anyone, and how reading is supposed to be fun. And that is all well and true. Reading is a form of entertainment, just like anything else. But I fear that the pendulum of that rhetoric is stretching a little too far to the other side, expanding beyond just being this kind of rejection of pretentiousness and snobbery and elitism, and actually maybe going into a place of anti-intellectualism, I fear. And also, let me be clear that I'm not trying to say that the anti-audiobook crowd and the anti-intellectual discourse is in direct response to one another or like has a direct cause and effect. I more so want to highlight just the kinds of rhetoric that comes up in these arguments and how they might be related and connected. And so with that, I want to go back to the idea of passiveness. I vehemently reject this idea that listening to audiobooks is passive. However, that doesn't mean that people in the book community at large are not reading passively, physical or audiobook or otherwise. And I think that's something to be talked about, and there can be many reasons for that, many of them benign. A lot of times people are just tired, they are just looking for something to relax, they have a lot going on in their life. They're simply trying to escape into a story because they want to relax their mind, not fill it with more thoughts. But at worst, people are actively ignoring or refusing to engage critically with the text, refusing to see any deeper meanings or think beyond surface level, refusing to see beyond their own perspective and only seeking to cater their own comfort. It's this latter part that is the most concerning. It's not just that people are not critically engaging with the text. There can be many reasons for that. Anti-intellectualism is this active refusal to engage with text on a deeper level, and also animosity towards people who do. We see this manifest in a lot of different ways in the book community. One way that is very common is when someone leaves a review for a very popular book that is negative and seemingly not in bad faith. And if they talk about what they found particularly problematic about what the book was saying or the author and their actions, they will undoubtedly get bombarded with people saying things like, "It's not that deep," or "I read to actually have fun." It reminds me a lot of the curtains are just blue discourse, which I think has done irreparable damage to the way that we consume media as a society. I feel like it gave people who hate academic analysis the permission to limit their interrogations of text to their most superficial aspects, and also just refuse to think that something could be beyond what is presented to them. To at least acknowledge that there could be different interpretations, that there could be some deeper meaning. Because sure, yeah, sometimes the curtains are just blue, but you have to be open to the idea that they are not before you can decidedly come to that conclusion. Everything in media, in entertainment, is a choice, whether it's active or not. It doesn't matter whether an author intentionally decided to create symbolism with their choice of description, but it doesn't mean that those choices came from nowhere. An example I have for this is actually not from the book community, but a few years ago when Across the Spider-Verse came out, there was a huge discourse online about whether the story functioned as a racial allegory. Someone made a video talking about how it was an allegory for racism, and particularly the racism that Black people experience in predominantly white institutions and also from other POC. Instead of having a thoughtful discussion about this interpretation, the stitchers and the comments went crazy at her, attacking her for essentially accusing Miguel O'Hara of being racist, even though that's not what her intention was. Even though she was talking about the potential commentary of the movie, and then of course you have people saying that she was inserting race into everything. What really bothers me is this idea that stories are only vehicles for our entertainment. Their only purpose is for our comfort and enjoyment, and that makes them not worth any deeper thought. My name is Maddie, has actually made a video about this idea of escapism and people saying that they don't want to think when they read. And what she points out that I really agree with is that it positions the enjoyment of stories as oppositional to thought. And that doesn't mean that stories are not entertaining or are not meant to be comforting, but it also doesn't mean that they don't have something to say. We can even look at a genre that is entirely structured around providing comfort and providing that happily ever after, and that's romance. Romance constantly gets kind of thrown under the bus as a sort of frivolous stories, but there is so much to be said with romantic stories, both individually and also on a trend level. Who is being featured? What races, ethnicities, gender, sexualities? How are characters shown to be desirable or not? And what are the implications of that? And overall, who is deemed eligible for happily ever after according to publishing and the reader base? If I haven't made it clear, every story is saying something, either positive or negative, and it doesn't have to be radical, but it's saying something, and to act like being conscious of that and being willing to dig deeper into that is oppositional to the enjoyment of reading because books are solely entertainment. That to me is a symptom of anti-intellectualism, this reduction of what stories are. And that kind of leads us to this last part of the discussion, which I find to be the most insidious and annoying, and it is the idea that reading is not political, or the more common rhetoric, don't insert politics into books. It really shouldn't have to be said, but everything is political, including reading. A creator on TikTok named Tell the Bees made a video describing how reading is political, who gets adequate education to learn how to read, who gets adequate access to books, what books and stories are being pushed as the canon. Even beyond the more material reasons why reading is political, I really take issue with this idea that politics are being inserted into books, as if they are not just naturally coming out of the stories that we tell, as if these stories exist beyond the domain of society and that politics exists beyond the domain of our everyday lives. Every book, movie, TV show, poster, commercial, every piece of media that exists is in conversation with society. Whether it is a product of it, a reflection of it, or a questioning, an argument against something in our society, they are connected. And to view entertainment as being in a vacuum that is disconnected from that is being intellectually dishonest. I think it's important to also mention that a lot of people are not just actively against politics in books or discussing those political themes, but they just don't always see it, either because they're not knowledgeable of the context or history that inspired it, or because they're putting entertainment at the forefront. It's very cliche, but The Hunger Games is a very good good example of this phenomenon. I don't think people are unaware that The Hunger Games is very political in nature, all dystopian is. However, Susan Collins was directly inspired by the Iraq War, of flipping through channels on the television, going from reality TV to children dying from bombs, and how desensitized we have become to violence and how we can ignore it for the sake of entertainment. It's a story of how propaganda is used to justify subjugation of a people for the sake of a so-called peace, and yet when it comes to real-world, modern situations like Israel and Palestine, people don't seem to understand the connections. Another aspect to this political dimension of reading that I think we should highlight is the idea of empathy. We constantly boast about how reading boosts and cultivates empathy in people, but I think that line of thinking presents empathy as something that is just a byproduct that comes naturally from reading and not a skill that you actively have to cultivate. Of course, reading makes it easier to build that skill. It is giving you a vehicle to put yourself into the mind and experience of someone else. But what if the only experiences and perspectives that you're reading are the ones that you already share? What if you only read stories where you can self-insert and not actually be willing to challenge your own perspectives? I guess my point with this is that empathy is obviously hugely important for politics, for thinking about the rights of other people, and we kind of hail reading as this foolproof way of developing empathy. We have to remember that reading only facilitates an opportunity for empathy. If you are not willing to think deeper about your own worldview, then you're not going to develop it. So I kind of went a lot of places in this video, so let's kind of like wrap it up and talk about how all these ideas are connected. What I really wanted to explore was this relationship with how we engage with text and our assumptions about it. I kind of want to discuss these ideas of how reading is either inherently intellectual or purely pieces of entertainment, or in my opinion, they're both. The argument against audiobooks counting as reading is at least partially rooted in this need to gatekeep who we call a reader, and it's because we've assigned this moralistic value to it. And that's not really the case. It doesn't matter how or what you read necessarily. It more so depends on how you approach reading that makes you a so-called intellectual. But I did want to include how on the other end of the spectrum, there is a rise of anti-intellectualism, where people want to protect their right to comfort by seeing books and reading as entertainment above anything else. I also wanted to push back against this idea that listening to audiobooks is automatically passive and stress that any form of reading, any form of engagement with media can be passive, and that is partially contributing to this problem of anti-intellectualism. I want to make it known that I don't think that anti-intellectualism is unique to the book community, but rather it's a widespread problem in this country, in this world, in this day and age, especially with the rise of AI. And my intention with this video is not to incite some sort of moral panic about what's going on, and I certainly don't want to present myself as perfect in this area, as someone who always critically reads, who always analyzes every form of media that they encounter. My intention really was just this discussion and looking at culture and what rhetoric is being propagated. The point that I want to leave this video on is that we all have the potential to be passive, to prioritize our own comfort, and to fall victim to propaganda even. Especially in this political climate, it is not enough to just read. We need to be thoughtful when we read, and we certainly should not be discouraging thought and discussion. On that note, please let me know your thoughts about anything that I touched on in this video, or anything about audiobooks, about anti-intellectualism, about books being political, anything that you feel worth sharing. I know this is probably going to be a super long video, so thank you so much for anyone who stayed all the way to the end. If you liked this video and you want to see more of my stuff, please consider subscribing. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.